12 hours ago, something happened in deep space that has almost zero chance of being natural, and yet every major observatory on Earth agrees that it did. On April 5, 2026, NASA's James Webb Space Telescope recorded an event linked to an object known as 3 Atlas, and the probability of what it did occurring naturally is calculated at just 0.00001%. That number alone should stop you, because what this object just demonstrated is not just unusual, it directly contradicts the fundamental laws we rely on to explain the universe. Here's what was observed. A diffuse cloud of hydrogen gas, spread thin across the vacuum of space, suddenly began collapsing inward. Not slowly over millions of years, like stars forming from nebulae, but rapidly, aggressively, and with extreme precision. 3 Atlas didn't just influence the cloud, it compressed it into a dense, solid, microscopic sphere. The European Space Agency actually detected the early signs of this nearly 2 days earlier, and when scientists began analyzing the full dataset, they found something that has no precedent in modern astrophysics. Picture an object located roughly 310 million kilometers from Earth, moving through a sparse interstellar medium, suddenly creating a localized force, gravitational or magnetic, that is so precise it begins pulling in surrounding gas and dust. Not loosely, not chaotically, but in a controlled and focused manner. That level of precision suggests something critical. Containment. And containment implies intention. Because in space, gas doesn't behave like this. It expands, always. Thermodynamics is clear: systems move toward disorder, not order. Entropy increases. That's one of the most reliable principles in physics. Yet what we're seeing here is the exact opposite. NASA's NICAM instrument recorded a sudden thermal shift at exactly 4:18 UTC. The surrounding gas cloud rapidly cooled, dropping in temperature, while at the same time, a central point within that cloud surged to over 4,500 Kelvin. This entire transition happened in just 3 hours. During that time, an estimated 14 million tons of nebula gas was compressed into a solid object measuring just 2.4 kilometers in diameter. Let that sink in. If you tried to achieve something similar using natural gravity, taking a massive cloud of gas and compressing it into something that small, it would take millions of years. 3 Atlas did it in 180 minutes. The statistical probability of that happening on its own? 1 in 4.8 billion. Even leading astrophysicists have acknowledged the problem. Dr. Avi Loeb at Harvard, who has spent years studying interstellar objects, stated that the mechanical forces required for this kind of condensation do not align with our current models of particle physics. When institutions like Harvard begin revising hydrodynamic equations in response to a single event, it's not routine, it's a signal that something fundamental doesn't add up. To visualize this, imagine watching a storm system on radar, clouds swirling, moving unpredictably, and then suddenly, in seconds, that entire system freezes into a perfectly solid sphere. Now scale that up to a cosmic level. That's what multiple observatories including James Webb, ALMA, and Hubble have independently confirmed. 3 different systems, different technologies, same conclusion. And the most important question isn't just how this happened, it's why. Because right now, as we speak, that compressed sphere still exists. It hasn't dispersed, it hasn't destabilized. And maintaining that state requires continuous energy, energy that appears to be increasing. This changes everything. Because if an object can manipulate matter at this scale, taking diffuse gas and turning it into a solid structure within hours, then our entire understanding of how planets, stars, and structures form in the universe is incomplete. But this is only the beginning of the anomaly. Before jumping to conclusions, we need to step back and understand what 3E Atlas actually is. It was first discovered on August 12, 2024, and initially classified as a typical interstellar object, similar to others like Oumuamua or Borisov. The assumption was simple: a chunk of ice and rock passing through our solar system after being ejected from another star system. But there was one key difference. It didn't behave like a comet. Normally, as comets approach the Sun, they heat up and release gas, forming a glowing coma and tail. 3 Atlas did neither. It retained its mass completely, showing no signs of outgassing. It behaved less like a melting object and more like a sealed system, almost like a vacuum chamber moving through space. And that alone was already unusual. But what happened next made it impossible to ignore. Because on April 2nd, at exactly 1422 UTC, everything changed. Because on April 2nd, at exactly 1422 UTC, everything changed, and what followed forced scientists to move from curiosity to concern. At that precise moment, NASA's Near-Earth Object Observations Program detected a sudden and massive disturbance in the interstellar medium surrounding 3 Atlas. This wasn't a minor fluctuation or background noise. The numbers were clear and measurable. A vast hydrogen cloud, stretching roughly 4.2 million kilometers across, began collapsing inward. Not drifting, not dispersing, collapsing. The James Webb Space Telescope, using its mid-infrared instrument, captured the thermal signature of this event as it began. The data showed something highly unusual. The temperature of the surrounding gas dropped sharply from an already cold baseline of 45 Kelvin down to just 12 Kelvin. And this didn't happen gradually. It occurred within 14 minutes. That kind of rapid cooling means one thing: energy was being removed from the system, aggressively. To understand how strange that is, imagine a massive storm system on Earth, millions of tons of moving air, suddenly freezing solid in seconds. No transition, no gradual change, just an immediate shift from motion to stillness. That's the closest comparison we have, and even that falls short. In astrophysics, gas clouds do not simply collapse into dense objects without immense gravitational forces. Usually, this kind of behavior only happens during star formation, where gravity pulls matter inward over millions of years. But 3 Atlas is only a few kilometers wide. Its natural gravity should be negligible. It should not have the ability to influence a cloud of that size at all. And yet, it did. At this point, independent verification became critical, and that's exactly what happened. NASA's James Webb Space Telescope recorded the thermal collapse at 1422 UTC. Just 6 minutes later, at 1428 UTC, the European Space Agency's Gaia spacecraft detected a gravitational microlensing effect, evidence that mass was rapidly concentrating in a single location. At the same time, the ALMA radio array in Chile measured a dramatic increase in molecular density using radio wavelengths. 3 separate systems, 3 different methods, 1 identical conclusion. A massive cloud of gas estimated at over 33 billion tons was being compressed into a dense, localized structure. And not just compressed, but controlled. Because here's what makes this even more difficult to explain. When gas collapses under pressure, it usually becomes unstable. It heats up, expands, and often results in violent reactions like explosions or fragmentation. But none of that happened here. Instead, the system remained stable throughout the entire process. That suggests something else was involved. A form of mechanical dampening, a way to suppress the natural tendency of matter to resist compression and return to equilibrium. And as of now, we don't have a model that explains how that could be achieved. But the sequence didn't stop there. Because after the gas was compressed into a solid structure, the system evolved even further, and this is where existing models at places like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory began to break down completely. At 1915 UTC on April 2nd, the newly formed sphere, now fully condensed, began orbiting the main body of 3E Atlas. The distance between them was measured at exactly 840 kilometers. The path was perfectly circular, with no signs of decay or instability. That alone is unusual. But what happened next pushed the anomaly into entirely new territory. At 3:44 UTC on April 3rd, the composition of that sphere changed. Spectroscopic analysis from Hubble's Wide Field Camera 3 revealed that the hydrogen inside the sphere had transitioned into a metallic state. Now, this is where the physics becomes extremely difficult to reconcile. Metallic hydrogen doesn't form under normal conditions. It requires pressures over 1,000,000 times greater than Earth's atmosphere conditions found only in the deep interiors of gas giants like Jupiter. To produce that state in open space, without a massive planetary core, is something we simply do not have the ability to explain, and yet the data confirms it. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. A diffuse gas cloud was collapsed into a solid sphere. Then, that sphere was transformed into a high-pressure metallic structure. All of this occurred in the vacuum of space, without any known mechanism capable of producing those conditions. And as of April 4th, the process has reached yet another stage. Because the metallic sphere has now stopped orbiting. It has moved. And it has merged directly with the surface of 3E Atlas. Seamlessly. No impact, no fragmentation, no visible disruption, just integration. First, the object gathered material. Then it compressed it. Then it transformed it. And now it has absorbed it. Each step more precise than the last, each stage more difficult to explain using known physics. And when you calculate the probability of all of these events happening in sequence, the number drops below 1 in 8.3 billion. At that point, the question is no longer whether this is natural. The question is, what kind of system behaves this way? Because this doesn't look like a comet. It looks like a process. And if it is a process, then something is controlling it. And just when scientists thought they had reached the peak of this anomaly, something happened next that made everything before it look like preparation. And just when scientists thought they had reached the peak of this anomaly, something happened next that made everything before it look like preparation rather than the main event. On April 4th, 2026, at exactly 6:12 UTC, NASA's Deep Space Network, specifically the DSS 4-3 antenna in Australia, detected a sudden and intense burst of electromagnetic radiation coming directly from 3E Atlas. This was not part of any predicted model. There were no prior signals suggesting such an event. It appeared instantly, without warning. But what made this detection extraordinary was not just the strength of the signal, it was its structure. The metallic sphere that had just merged with the object began to emit a pulsing magnetic field. Not a chaotic or random emission, but a highly organized oscillation. The field peaked at exactly 87.63 Tesla. To understand how extreme that is, consider this. The strongest magnetic fields humans can generate in laboratories reach only a fraction of that strength, and even then, they exist for only brief moments. Sustaining a field of 87.63 Tesla requires a continuous and highly controlled energy source. In nature, magnetic fields of this scale are typically produced by dynamo systems involving rotating, electrically conductive fluids, like the molten iron core inside Earth. But 3E Atlas is not a planet. It is a small object, only a few kilometers in size. It should not have a molten interior, and it certainly should not be capable of sustaining a dynamo effect. And yet, the data shows exactly that. At this point, the established laws we use to describe magnetism, thermodynamics, and material states begin to fail. Because when you look at the sequence as a whole, the numbers become increasingly difficult to justify. The probability that a random comet could collapse a nebula cloud of that size is already close to zero. The probability that the resulting material would transform into metallic hydrogen in a vacuum is, by definition, zero. Thermodynamics does not allow it, and the probability that both events would occur within a 30-hour window, followed by the generation of a stable, high-intensity magnetic field, creates a statistical scenario that is effectively impossible. To put it in simple terms, it would be like flipping a coin millions of times and having it land on its edge every single time and then suddenly turning into a completely different material. In over 4 million years of observational data across more than 12,000 cataloged cometary objects, nothing like this has ever been recorded. Not once. So we are forced to consider the implications. The standard explanation that this is a highly unusual comet undergoing extreme outgassing no longer holds. Because 99.8% of known comets behave in a predictable way, they lose mass as they approach a star. They heat up, release gas, and gradually break down. 3E Atlas is doing the opposite. It is gaining mass. It is collecting material, compressing it, refining it, and integrating it. A better analogy would be a sponge that doesn't just absorb water, but actively compresses it into a solid, unbreakable core. And now, the situation becomes even more complex, because as this process continues, the object itself has started to move in ways that cannot be explained by gravity alone. As of the latest observations, its trajectory has changed. Not slightly, not gradually, deliberately. 18 hours ago, the European Space Agency's Gaia spacecraft recorded a deviation of 0.04 degrees from its predicted orbit. At 12 hours ago, that deviation increased, with the object accelerating at 3 times its previous rate. And 6 hours ago, it executed a maneuver that required an estimated energy output of 4.2 petajoules. That level of energy is not trivial. It is far beyond what a passive object drifting through space could generate. And once again, independent verification confirmed the observation. NASA's James Webb Space Telescope tracked the shift using its near-infrared camera. The ALMA array verified the change through Doppler measurements. And the Keck Observatory in Hawaii confirmed the optical coordinates. 3 different systems, 3 different methods, one identical conclusion. The object is actively adjusting its trajectory. To visualize this, imagine throwing a baseball. Mid-flight, it suddenly stops, pulls moisture from the surrounding air, freezes it into a solid shell, and then changes direction at a sharp angle while accelerating to several times its original speed. That is the closest comparison to what we are observing, and it leads to a critical question. Where is the energy coming from? Because manipulating tens of billions of tons of matter, generating powerful magnetic fields, and altering trajectory in real time all require a consistent and extremely high energy source. Even the most cautious scientists are now acknowledging that this does not fit within any known category of natural objects. Dr. Thomas Zurbuchen, former Associate Administrator for NASA's Science Mission Directorate, has publicly stated that the telemetry data resembles a governed, powered system rather than a passive celestial body. That is not a casual statement. And when the European Space Agency begins coordinating emergency data sharing with defense organizations, it signals that this event is being taken very seriously at the highest levels. But even this is not the most unusual part, because when researchers began analyzing the internal properties of the metallic sphere, they discovered something that changes the entire interpretation of what this object might be doing. Something that moves this beyond physics and into something far more deliberate. And when researchers began analyzing the internal properties of that metallic sphere, they uncovered something that shifts this entire situation from an extreme physics anomaly into something that appears structured, controlled, and possibly intentional, because the metallic hydrogen sphere was not just sitting there as a compressed mass. It was behaving like a superconductor. That detail changes everything. At exactly 8:45 UTC today, new readings showed that the surface temperature of 3E Atlas dropped to 0.3 Kelvin. That is just a fraction of a degree above absolute zero, the coldest temperature theoretically possible. What makes this even more difficult to explain is that this temperature is lower than the surrounding space itself. In simple terms, the object became colder than the vacuum around it. That should not happen. Heat naturally flows from warmer regions to colder ones. It dissipates, it spreads. But here, heat wasn't just leaving the object, it was being actively removed from the surrounding environment. It was as if energy was being extracted and erased at a local level. And the data supports that conclusion. A rapid spectral analysis conducted by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology revealed that ambient radiation in the immediate area was being absorbed at a rate of 99.9%. That includes background microwave radiation, the faint energy left over from the early universe itself. The object is not just interacting with its environment, it is consuming it. Now consider what that implies. Energy absorption at this level is something we typically associate with extreme phenomena, like the event horizon of a black hole. But there is no black hole here. There is no massive gravitational collapse. There is only a relatively small object, a metallic structure, and a magnetic field that continues to pulse with precision. And that magnetic field, the one measured at 87.63 Tesla, is no longer just a byproduct of earlier processes. It appears to be functioning as a containment system, a controlled environment where energy, matter, and temperature are being managed simultaneously. And then there's another detail. The trajectory of 3 Atlas is not random. It is not drifting freely under the influence of gravity alone. It is correcting itself consistently. Observations show that the object adjusts its path every 42 minutes, maintaining a highly controlled course through space. That kind of behavior suggests guidance, not passive motion, not natural drift, but active navigation. At this point, the probability of this being a natural cosmic fluctuation has been calculated at just 0.17%. And even that number is considered generous by some researchers, because when you look at the full sequence matter compression, phase transformation, energy absorption, magnetic containment, and controlled trajectory, each layer reinforces the same conclusion. This is not random. This is ordered. And that directly challenges one of the most fundamental principles we rely on to understand the universe: entropy. We are taught that systems move toward disorder over time, that energy spreads out, structures break down, and complexity decreases without external input. But what we are witnessing here is the opposite. Order is increasing, structure is forming, complexity is being built in real time. A diffuse nebula is not just condensing, it is being reorganized into a precise, stable configuration. And that raises a critical question. If this is not a natural process, then what is driving it? Because the level of coordination required to execute these steps without error, without instability, suggests more than just advanced physics. It suggests a system designed to achieve a specific outcome. And that brings us to the moment that changed how this entire event is being interpreted. Because until now, everything we've discussed, no matter how extreme, could still be framed as physical processes, even if we didn't fully understand them. But what happened next cannot be explained by physics alone. Just 2 hours ago, this data triggered a classified emergency briefing at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Telescopes around the world were immediately redirected. Data streams were prioritized. Real-time analysis began. Up until that point, scientists believed the condensation of nebula gas and the formation of the metallic sphere were the main events, the peak of the anomaly. They were wrong, because deep within that metallic core, something else was happening, something that was not part of any known natural process. And when the James Webb Space Telescope captured it, the entire framework for understanding this object began to collapse. Because what this object did next wasn't just about matter or energy. It was about information. And once you see what was detected, it becomes very difficult to argue that this is anything other than deliberate. And once the focus shifted from matter and energy to information, the entire meaning of this event changed in a way no one was prepared for, because what the James Webb Space Telescope detected next was not another physical transformation. It wasn't a shift in temperature, pressure, or composition. It was something far more specific and far more difficult to dismiss. It was a signal. On April 4, 2026, at exactly 9:14 UTC, instruments aboard the telescope recorded a transmission originating from the core of 3E Atlas. At first, researchers assumed it was noise, an artifact of the earlier electromagnetic activity. But as the data was processed, a pattern began to emerge. And that pattern was not random. It matched something we have seen before. The signal being transmitted was structurally identical to the Arecibo message, the encoded radio broadcast humanity sent into space in 1974, aimed at the globular star cluster M13. That message contained basic information about human biology, DNA structure, our solar system, and our technological state. But this signal was not a simple reflection. It had been modified. The structure was the same, the encoding method was identical, and the clarity of the transmission measured at 99.9%. But the content had changed in one critical way. The DNA sequence embedded in the message was no longer carbon-based. It had been replaced with a silicon-based double helix. That detail alone has forced scientists to reconsider everything they thought they understood about this object. Because if this were a natural reflection, just a signal bouncing off a surface, then the data should have remained unchanged. Electromagnetic reflections do not rewrite information. And if this were a random emission, then the probability of it replicating a structured human-made signal with near-perfect accuracy is effectively zero, which leaves one possibility. The signal was intentionally recreated and altered. Now consider what that implies. This object not only detected a message sent from Earth decades ago, but it processed it, modified its biological component, and transmitted it back directly toward our planet. And the targeting was precise. The signal was aimed at a 70-meter deep space network antenna in California from a distance of approximately 240 million kilometers. That level of accuracy requires more than just emission. It requires direction, calibration, and awareness of the receiver's position. In other words, it requires intent. At this point, multiple independent sources verified the transmission. European Space Agency data matched NASA's readings. The signal was not a glitch. It was not an isolated error. It was real, repeatable, and measurable. And this is where the situation escalated beyond science into protocol. Within hours of confirming the signal, NASA initiated an emergency data classification process. Incoming telemetry from key instruments was restricted, and a temporary data blackout was enforced. In over 4 decades of continuous space observation, actions like this are extremely rare. That alone indicates the level of seriousness attached to what was just detected. Even researchers known for cautious interpretation have begun to shift their stance. Dr. Avi Loeb, who has long studied interstellar anomalies, described the event as paradigm-shifting, something that forces a reconsideration of existing models, not just a minor adjustment, because the implications are not limited to physics anymore. They extend into communication and possibly intelligence. Let's step back and look at what we now know with certainty. 3E Atlas has actively condensed tens of billions of tons of gas into a solid structure. It has transformed that structure into metallic hydrogen under conditions that should not exist. it has generated a powerful and stable magnetic field. It has adjusted its trajectory with precision and energy beyond natural explanation.